I finally gave birth to a daughter with the man I had loved for many years. But when our daughter was critically ill, he cheated on me with his company secretary. When he hurried to the funeral, my eyes were swollen from crying, and I said, word by word, "Jonathan, I regret it." When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back in our high school days. I met the young and passionate Jonathan, who tearfully asked me, "Vivian, are you avoiding me?" Chapter 1. The procedure was unsuccessful. Please accept our condolences. The doctor's words cut through me like a knife, spreading pain through my heart. I leaned against the wall, step by step, approaching the small body covered with a white sheet. Just before entering the operating room, she had gently touched my face, comforting me. "Mommy, don't be sad. Yaya doesn't hurt at all. Yaya is very strong." I lay beside the hospital bed, holding her cold hand, unable to shed a single tear. Memories of my daughter's life flashed through my mind. Such a lively and adorable life had vanished just like that. I suppressed my pain and brought my daughter's ashes home. During this time, I called Jonathan countless times, but each call was ignored. From initial anxiety to worry, I was finally numbed by a photo of him in bed with someone else. Jonathan had cheated. While our daughter was suffering on the operating table, he and that young secretary were in a hotel room. In one night, I lost two loved ones in my world. At my daughter Evelyn's funeral, relatives and friends wept with sorrow. Everyone knew how obedient and sweet Yaya was. Even during her stay in the hospital, no matter how much pain she was in, she never wanted to worry her mother. Her only wish was to see her parents before going into the operating room. For this, I desperately called Jonathan, who was giving me the cold shoulder. He impatiently hung up, eventually turning off his phone. My daughter didn't want to make things difficult for me. She touched my face and comforted me. "It's okay, Mommy. With you here, Yaya is not afraid of anything." At the funeral, I held Yaya's photo alone, my heart numb with pain. Jonathan suddenly appeared at the funeral, frowning as he walked through the crowd. His gaze fell on my swollen eyes. "Vivian, haven't you had enough?" He no longer asked why I was crying, only blamed me for causing a scene. I held Yaya's photo tighter, looking up at the man I had loved for so many years. "Jonathan, I regret it." My eyes were so swollen that I could barely see his face clearly. He seemed slightly flustered but still said, "Huh, you're pulling this trick again, using divorce to threaten me?" I thought my heart had already become numb, but his words made me tremble with pain, unable to hold onto the photo in my arms. The black and white photo fell between me and Jonathan. He crouched down to pick up the photo. "Vivian, are you really using Yaya to deceive me now? Do you even deserve to be a mother?" His tone was filled with anger, and his eyes were full of disdain as he looked at me. I stood up to snatch the photo from his hand, but he pushed me away. I fell backward, hitting my head on the edge of the table. In the last moment before losing consciousness, it seemed like Jonathan was reaching out to me. This time, I chose to avoid him. Chapter 2. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back in high school, just when Jonathan and I had started dating. My desk mate, Amy, nudged me, pointing to the door. "Look, Jonathan is here to bring you some brown sugar water." Following her gaze, I saw the young, slightly naive Jonathan, holding something in his arms. At this time, his heart and mind were full of me. I turned my head away, suppressing the pain in my heart, unwilling to entangle with him any further. But the young Jonathan didn't know. He only thought I was feeling unwell due to my period. He stuffed the black plastic bag into my desk and handed me the thermos cup with brown sugar water. "Brown sugar water. It's good for you during your period." His eyes sparkled with anticipation, which only irritated me. I pushed his hand away forcefully. The brown sugar water spilled all over, soaking his pants. The surrounding students gasped, looking at us. Jonathan pulled out some tissues to clean my desk first, then his pants. Amy cautiously tugged at me. "Vivian, what's wrong with you today? Did Jonathan upset you?" Jonathan also looked up at me. "Vivian, What did I do to upset you? It's all my fault. I shouldn't have made you unhappy during your period. You can punish me. Just like before, he held my hand to make me hit him. Thinking of the photo of him and the secretary years later, I pulled my hand back in disgust. Jonathan was stunned by my look of disdain. Don't touch me. You're dirty. The classroom fell silent instantly. Various gazes shifted between me and Jonathan. Jonathan finally placed a piece of white rabbit candy on my desk before turning to leave. Amy looked at me in disbelief. Vivian, what's wrong with you today? Did you and Jonathan have a fight? I was filled with disgust and hatred, casually sweeping the candy off the desk. Don't mention him in front of me anymore. Amy opened her mouth but didn't say anything. Until class started, when I was looking for a book in my desk, I noticed the black plastic bag Jonathan had left. It contained my usual sanitary pads, thoughtfully divided into day and night use. But all I felt was nausea. After class, I threw the black plastic bag and the thermos cup into the trash can. A figure around the corner froze. By the time I looked over, it was gone. Chapter 3. When school was over, most of the classmates had already left. I was exhausted from my period and lay on the desk to relieve the pain. Someone stopped in front of my desk. I looked up to see a bewildered Jonathan. His face overlapped with the one who had berated me at the funeral, and I frowned in disgust. Go away. Jonathan's fingers trembled, but he didn't move. When I looked up again to chase him away, I saw that his eyes were already red. The word go stuck in my throat. Ignoring my resistance, Jonathan squatted in front of me. I'll carry you home. It's about to rain. The sky outside was darkening, looking ominous. I stared at his somewhat thin back, my eyes stinging with tears. I harshly said again, Jonathan, do you not understand? I told you to go away. I saw his hand clench until it was white, and the veins on his arm bulging. Why? His voice trembled. Because I think you're dirty. I hate you. You disgust me. Hearing this, Jonathan slowly stood up, swaying slightly, his eyes full of pain. Perhaps the young Jonathan didn't understand why the girl he loved suddenly said such vicious words. Boom! A loud thunderclap was followed by a torrential downpour. Jonathan left, and it took me a while to gather myself. Before leaving, he said, I'm sorry. I was momentarily dazed. In my previous life, I never had the heart to say such things to Jonathan. Thinking about it, I laughed bitterly. In my previous life, I never thought Jonathan would betray me. The heavy rain blocked my way home. The sky had completely darkened. I remembered the time I spent with my daughter. On a similar rainy day, my daughter snuggled in my arms, sweetly calling me Mommy. Those beautiful memories seemed so distant, like they were from another century, only to be constantly reminisced. Until a tissue was handed to me, I realized I was already crying. Jonathan held the tissue, his eyes filled with sadness. Seeing his familiar yet youthful face, the pain of losing my daughter resurfaced, and I forced my voice to remain calm. Let's break up. Don't bother me anymore. With that, I ran into the rain. The rain was heavy, cold against my body, but I felt nothing, walking numbly, like a lifeless shell. Suddenly, I saw a small figure in the rain ahead, standing there looking at me, as if saying, Mommy, Yaya is here. The rain blurred my vision, but I ran forward regardless, mumbling, Yaya. Yaya, Mommy is coming. Yaya, wait for Mommy. In the pouring rain, I couldn't see the surroundings or the world, I only saw my Yaya waiting for me. I kept running, hearing only the sound of the rain. So much so that I didn't notice the oncoming car. I was thrown forward, but someone pushed me aside. The screeching brakes were painfully loud amidst the rain. I crawled towards the fallen Jonathan. Blood spread beneath him. He struggled in pain, reaching out to me. He said, Vivian, please don't break up with me. Chapter 4. Outside the operating room, I shivered with cold, huddled on a chair in the hallway. An elderly woman hurried over, her silver hair wet with water, her face streaked with tears. She anxiously paced in front of the operating room, muttering, "Please, please, let Jonathan be okay. Bless him, bless him." I recognized her. She was Jonathan's grandmother, his only family in this world. In my previous life, Jonathan and I applied to the same university. He happily took me to meet his grandmother, who liked me so much that she gave me the family heirloom bracelet. Later, when she was on her deathbed, she sent Jonathan away and held my hand, asking me to take good care of him. I truly loved him at that time. Despite knowing the risks, I still chose to have a child with him because he had said that too few people loved him in this world. After his grandmother passed, there would only be me. So I had a daughter, thinking that if there was one more person in the world to love him, he would be happier. But reality stabbed me in the heart, filling me with sorrow. The photo of him and the secretary made our past love seem like a joke. Bitterness seeped through my mouth. I didn't know whether it was from the cold or the pain, but tears flowed down my face without me realizing it. Until Jonathan's grandmother draped a clean coat over me. "Child, don't catch a cold." Her kind face reminded me of those simple and beautiful moments with Jonathan. I returned the coat and was about to leave when the operating room door finally opened. Jonathan was safe. Outside the ward, I stood for a long time, until my body was stiff, my head dizzy, and the world spinning before my eyes. I had a high fever severely. Having my period, being drenched in the rain, and waiting outside the operating room for hours in wet clothes, I caught a cold and had a fever of 103.5 F. Jonathan and I shared the same ward. When I woke up, he had been staring at me for who knows how long. His lips were pale, but his gaze was fixed on me. My voice was hoarse as if I had swallowed a knife. "Jonathan." The light in his eyes brightened instantly when he heard me call his name. "Let's not contact each other anymore. Let's pretend to be strangers." Saying this, I couldn't stop coughing violently, my eyes filling with tears, and the image of Jonathan blurred. Coughing made my throat hurt, and my heart felt like it was breaking apart. Jonathan closed his eyes slowly, his hand clenching, the veins on his neck bulging. He was in great pain, more than from being hit by a car and suffering multiple fractures. I buried my head in the blanket, not wanting him to see my already wet eyes. "Vivian." In my drowsiness, I seemed to hear Jonathan's voice. As I drifted off, I heard him say, "Vivian, don't leave me." My dreams were chaotic. I first saw the young Jonathan, blushing as he bought sanitary pads for me. Then I saw him crying at our wedding. I saw him beaming with joy when our daughter was born. I also saw him impatiently scolding me for causing trouble. Lastly, I saw my daughter crying for her parents on the operating table. Every step closer to my daughter made my heart ache more, the pain spreading from my heart to my fingertips, until my whole hand trembled with numbness. As I endured the excruciating pain to hug my daughter, she waved at me. "Goodbye, Mommy." "No. Don't." "Yeah." I woke up, drenched in sweat, my pillow soaked with tears. I gasped for breath, and someone gently patted my back. Jonathan's grandmother looked at me with concern. "Child, are you all right? Did you have a nightmare? Dreams aren't real, don't be afraid." I instinctively retorted, "No, it's not fake." She paused, then handed me the soup she had prepared. "You've been asleep for so long, you must be hungry. Try some of my soup, my grandson loves it." Her grandson, Jonathan, was watching me quietly at this moment, his gaze burning. I wanted to refuse, but the aroma of the chicken soup was too tempting, and my stomach growled. The warm, delicious chicken soup warmed my body, and the taste lingered in my mouth. My eyes welled up again. This taste was all too familiar to me. In my previous life, when I had just married Jonathan, I was often unwell and very thin. Jonathan would buy a chicken every few days from the market to make soup. He proudly said, "Vivian, this soup is a family recipe from my grandmother. You'll love it." I did love it, or rather, I loved the taste of Jonathan making soup for me with love. But after giving birth to our daughter and Jonathan becoming busier with work, I never tasted such delicious chicken soup again. Oh dear, child, is the soup too hot? Why are you crying again? Jonathan's grandmother wiped my tears with concern. I forced a smile and shook my head. No, the soup is delicious. Thank you, Grandma. And Jonathan, lying on the other bed, kept his gaze fixed on me. Chapter 5. Late at night, I curled up under the blanket. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Yaya's small body under the white cloth and that damning photo. I sat up in bed, my temples throbbing, my eyes swollen beyond recognition. Vivian, did you have another nightmare? Jonathan forced himself to sit up, meeting my gaze. Yes. I replied, then turned my back on him and covered my head with the blanket. Jonathan was silent for a long time before he spoke again. Vivian, are you avoiding me? Did I do something wrong? Can you forgive me, Vivian? His tone was full of disappointment. Perhaps at this moment, he didn't really understand what he had done wrong, he just felt that I was unhappy, and it was his fault. I threw off the blanket, letting the fresh air hit my face. Jonathan, let's break up. I don't like you anymore. Jonathan panicked. He struggled to get closer to me but tugged at his wounds, gasping in pain. Despite the agony, he held back the pain and said, trembling, "But I like you. I've always liked you." I let out a sarcastic laugh. His current look of pain and sadness overlapped with the image of his impatient face from before. Really? Will you always like me? I swear it, Vivian. I swear I'll always like you. It sounded like the biggest joke, and I couldn't help but laugh out loud. In the quiet night, my laughter was jarring. What if I told you that in the future, you'll not only despise me but also betray me and fall in love with someone else? Jonathan immediately retorted. Impossible, Vivian. I will never despise you, let alone betray you. His eyes were firm, his tone resolute. If I hadn't experienced everything from my past life, I might have believed him. Jonathan gritted his teeth, trying to stand up and get closer to me, each step excruciatingly painful. His forehead was covered in cold sweat. Vivian, believe me. I will never let you down. He finally grabbed my hand, holding it tightly, his eyes full of hope. What if I told you that I dreamed you would not only despise me and betray me but also let our daughter suffer on the operating table? I slowly pulled my hand back, covering myself with the blanket and turning away from him. He stood by my bed for a long time before I heard him slowly move back to his own bed. We didn't speak a word until I was discharged from the hospital. When I returned to school, I saw my diary where I had written down my dream college to university. Next to it was a university, the place Jonathan and I had agreed to go. I tore out that page, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash. Amy was stunned. Vivian, what's gotten into you lately? You used to look at that page before every class. Now you're tearing it up. I solemnly wrote to university in my diary, deciding to live for myself this time. Without Jonathan's presence, my nightmares became less frequent, though I still occasionally dreamed of Yaya. She never let me get close, always looking at me from a distance. A month passed peacefully. I was busy working towards my dream college, and the events of my past life seemed to fade away. Yaya almost never appeared in my dreams. Until Amy started acting strangely around me, hesitating as if she had something to say. What's wrong, Amy? She sighed. Vivian, Jonathan hasn't come to class for 3 days. The teachers can't reach him, and I heard his grandmother cried so much she ended up in the hospital. I pressed down on my pencil so hard it snapped, leaving a noticeable hole in my notebook. Maybe I should have felt gratified that Jonathan was getting his comeuppance. But my heart still ached because this was the young Jonathan, the most sincere Jonathan. After school, I passed by the park, and a white cat came out, rubbing against my legs. Jonathan and I used to bring bread and milk for it every time we left school. It was very proud, only letting me pet it. Whenever Jonathan tried, it would bare its teeth at him, but then it would nuzzle under my hand. Jonathan used to say with certainty. It's definitely a male cat, definitely. I laughed at how serious he was. Lost in thought, I searched my bag but found nothing to feed it. I apologized, rubbing its head. Sorry, I didn't bring anything today. A small piece of bread was handed to me. I looked up to see a disheveled and exhausted Jonathan. My heart felt like it was being squeezed. Where have you been? Jonathan's eyes were ringed with dark circles, bloodshot. Vivian, this is for you. He handed me a wooden box. So, this was why he had disappeared for 3 days. Jonathan took my hand and put a wooden bracelet on my wrist. Wear this, and you won't have nightmares. For some reason, the wooden bracelet felt incredibly heavy. Jonathan held my hand, his eyes almost pleading. Vivian, please, no more nightmares. Don't leave me, okay? At 17 or 18, Jonathan's heart and mind were full of me. He was begging me not to reject his younger self because of what he would become. Bitterness spread in my mouth. It's not a dream, Jonathan. It's not a dream. The image of Yaya's pained yet brave face on the operating table kept replaying in my mind. Jonathan's impatience and disdain felt as fresh as yesterday. I smiled bitterly and withdrew my hand. Don't come looking for me anymore. It's over. I took off the wooden bracelet and placed it back in his hand. Jonathan grabbed my arm as I was about to leave, his eyes wet with tears. Vivian, we promised to go to a university together. Does that still count? I shook my head. The light in Jonathan's eyes finally went out. Chapter 6. Mr. James, your wife is physically fine. By all accounts, she should wake up soon, but she shows no signs of regaining consciousness. I suspect she might not want to wake up. Jonathan responded weakly. Okay. He sat by my hospital bed, hands covering his face. He never imagined that in a moment of anger, a simple push would cause me to hit my head and end up in a coma, now looking half dead. He also never imagined that our Yaya, our sweet, obedient daughter, would leave us forever. Jonathan recalled those days when I frantically called him, and he impatiently hung up. If he had answered, maybe he wouldn't have missed seeing our daughter one last time. Thinking of this, he wanted to strangle himself. I lay quietly on the hospital bed, my eyes closed, as if I were just asleep and would wake up any moment, sweetly calling him. Johnny. Just then, his secretary called. Jonathan, it's been so long since you came to see me. Jonathan frowned, his voice cold. Didn't I tell you not to disturb my family anymore? The secretary, however, laughed softly. Jonathan, what's the point of that family now? One's gone and one's half gone. In such a depressing environment, you'd be better off with me. Jonathan's face darkened. Do you want to end this? The secretary laughed again. Jonathan, you weren't saying that in bed. You said my waist was soft, that you couldn't get enough of me, and that I was 1,000 times better than that old hag at home. Oh, and you said you thought your wife giving birth to a daughter was a waste of money. Jonathan, feeling guilty, covered the phone and glanced at my unconscious form, afraid I might hear. He retreated to the stairwell, unable to hold back his anger any longer, and yelled at the secretary. Do you want to end this? Pack your things. If you ever show up in my life again, I promise you'll regret it. The secretary showed no fear. Jonathan, you're still so impulsive. Now that Vivian won't wake up, who will comfort you? Just like on your wedding anniversary, when you couldn't stand her nagging and ran to my house in the middle of the night to complain? Jonathan's fists clenched tightly, veins bulging on his forehead. Shut up. It was as if all the dirty deeds he'd done were laid bare, making him feel both ashamed and furious. Fine, I'll shut up. But I'm expecting, Jonathan. You're going to have a son. I had it checked, it's definitely a boy, not a useless daughter like before. It felt like someone had hit Jonathan over the head. He had another reason to feel guilty about betraying me. He had a feeling I would never forgive him. His heart felt like it was being torn apart, pain spreading through his body, a string pulling at his nerves, slowly ripping him apart. Jonathan squatted in the stairwell, the phone dropping by his feet. Ignoring the secretary's incessant chatter, he felt a splitting headache, punching the wall repeatedly. Blood spread on the white wall. Jonathan finally rested his head against it, crying uncontrollably. That night, he had a rare good sleep. He dreamed of his high school self, full of love for me, wanting to pluck stars from the sky for me. Back then, I was still a bit naive, my eyes bright, smiling when I was with him. We walked home together in the sunset, our shadows lengthening. Everything was so beautiful. But the young Jonathan suddenly turned around, his body exuding a chill as he walked towards his 30-year-old self. The young Jonathan punched him in the face. Standing over him, eyes full of contempt. "How could you betray her? You jerk!" Punch after punch landed on him. His body didn't hurt, but his heart ached so much he couldn't breathe. "You don't deserve her. You jerk! You don't deserve to marry her. You've lost her forever." The young Jonathan screamed at him, then collapsed, covering his face and sobbing. The young me glanced back at them once, then walked away without looking back. Jonathan reached out, wanting to hold me back. "Vivian, don't leave me." The young Jonathan stood up, blocking his view. "Let her go. Don't disturb her anymore." The 30-year-old Jonathan suddenly felt a lump in his throat. Finally, he sat on the street, crying his heart out, not caring about his image. When he woke up, Jonathan's eyes were swollen, and his pillow was wet with tears. He slapped his face, relieved it was just a dream. He grabbed some clothes from the wardrobe hastily. He had only one thought. He needed to see me, to tell me that I was still the one he loved the most. As he left, he was so nervous he couldn't press the elevator button properly. As nervous as he was on his first date with me, stepping on his own feet. He took deep breaths, telling himself to stay calm. While waiting at the traffic light, he even fixed his hair in the mirror, like a shy teenager going to see his beloved girl. But the hospital called him. Just moments ago, I had flatlined. Jonathan hung up, stunned. He leaned back in his car seat, the initial nervousness replaced by fear. He frantically pulled at his hair, repeatedly asking himself, "Did Vivian die? Did Vivian leave me? Will Vivian never forgive me?" The cars behind him honked incessantly, their blaring horns echoing. An impatient driver knocked heavily on his window. Jonathan stepped out, and before the driver could speak, he collapsed, clutching his head and crying. A 30-year-old man sobbing on the crowded road. Chapter 7. Epilogue. Young Jonathan. Before the college entrance exams, Jonathan had a dream. He dreamed that he grew up to marry his beloved Vivian and had a sweet, well-behaved daughter. But before he could be happy, he saw his 30-year-old self not only despising and annoying Vivian but also cheating with his secretary, ignoring their daughter when she was sick, even insulting Vivian as unfit to be a mother. When he woke up, Jonathan felt panicked. He finally understood why Vivian's attitude towards him had suddenly changed, why she found him disgusting and dirty. It turned out he had done so many horrible things to her. For the first time, he was filled with disgust and hatred for his future self. He loathed the scumbag he would become. On the day of the college entrance exams, he saw Vivian come out of the exam room, her face full of happiness as she ran into her family's arms. She smiled like a blooming flower, finally achieving her dream college and the life she wanted. Because of the pre-exam dream, Jonathan's exam results were terrible, causing his grandmother to fall sick with worry. While taking care of his grandmother in the hospital, he ran into Vivian. He anxiously asked, "Are you sick?" He expected her to tell him to get lost or ignore him. But she just smiled faintly. "It's nothing serious. Just getting my teeth checked." Her calm and distant smile made Jonathan feel worse, as it meant he no longer had a place in her heart. As Vivian turned to leave, Jonathan called out, "Vivian!" "Yes? I'm sorry." He had hesitated over these 3 words for a long time, but now he finally said them, apologizing for the future him. Vivian hesitated for a moment but quickly smiled and walked away. Ahead of her was a new beginning.